You're watching Thorin's YouTube channel. Please seek professional help.
Now, I'm about to tee off on some fan-submitted questions from my patrons. But did you know Gamer Subs, the energy formula I often talk about, because I think it's excellent, and you can get 10% off with the code Thorin at gamersubs.gg, THORIN. I often point out I love their Guacamole Gamer Fart 9000, it's really strawberry and lime. I like the citrus lemonade, I like blue raz. It's a whole bunch of Arctic coolers, eating some I just have on the side every now and then. But they also have tea now, and as well as caffeine teas, yerba mate, etc., black tea, they've also got an L-theanine one that doesn't have caffeine. So at the end of your day, maybe after you've had your Gamer Subs earlier in the day, you have an L-theanine tea, helps you go off to sleep. It could be a good part of your sleep stack to get off, since everyone's obviously having problems with all the devices and, I can't go to sleep, I'm not reading a book, we all know what's going on. So anyway, check it out, Gamer Subs tea. As usual, they have other flavours I don't mention. Arctic Coolers, one that I just sort of do every now and then. Anime Girl Fi is some sort of orange dreamsicle one. They have loads of new ones. They have so many flavours, and so many actually tied to creators even. By the way, for my Patreon AMAs, same thing I always say with a donator discussion. If someone out there was a former patron at a tier where you can ask a question here, and you either didn't ask a question or didn't ask enough, feel free to hit me up, tell me your username, tell me what months you paid for. I'll check it all out. If it all checks out, you can ask questions. Just submit me some questions, you can be in the next one. Right, Toucan says, since the big trophies that players look to win in their CS careers nowadays are the majors, colognes and Katowices, so what I call the prestige tournaments, how much prestige do historical tournaments like E-League, ECS, Epicenter and others add to a player's resume? Right, the key thing here is it differs, because those other events, if you take a look in the history of Counter-Strike, realistically, as long as it actually is EMS or ESL1, Katowice or Cologne, those events are pretty much in CSGO all big enough to be considered at a major level or just below a major level. In general, you look throughout history, there's not really any that were like kind of sus. I mean, yeah, true, Astralis chose to skip Cologne in 2017, which implies at the time they didn't think of it as being as big. But I would say around that time is when it solidified that even if they're not majors, those events are pretty much as good or sometimes better with the format now. So the key thing for me is this. Since everyone can sort of take that, and in history, if you just look in CSGO at majors and or these prestige events, you're going to have a pretty good track record, minus the two that came around the online era. Obviously, well, just before the online era, Katowice 2020 had no crowd in the stadium part, so I'm sorry, it does make it not as crazy that Na'Vi stomped everyone. And then obviously when Na'Vi came back and stomped everyone again at Cologne in 2021, that had no crowd at all at the whole event. It wasn't in the whole cathedral of Counter-Strike, the Lanxess, so that also wasn't really a Cologne. So those two, okay, maybe those two need an asterisk, but aside from that, every other Cologne and Katowice can count. Then the issue becomes, there's not a hard or fast rule for the other ones. Like generally the events you're talking about. So E-League, Epicenter, and I'll just go ahead and throw in other ones like Star Series. The best of those events would be considered the best events that aren't the prestige events. Like I think if you look at like ESL, ESEA, Invitational Dubai in 2015, like aren't Star Series events in like 2018 as good as that? Like, yeah, they don't have the same like stadium setup always, but I'll tell you what, they have better teams, they have an amazing field, they had a really good format. Like, why wouldn't that be as good just because it's not off in Dubai? Some of it's just in the Cyber Arena in Kiev. So I would say the main issue you're going to have is they're generally going to be the best of the other events. So they're sort of the medium-sized events or the other 250k tournaments that are the big ones. But there's going to be context based on the time period. So as usual, you're going to have to sort of know what era we're talking about. So they're not all unique. They're not all uniform, rather, in terms of when they meant a lot and when they didn't mean as much. So for example, the first two seasons of E-League were huge. That was when it was like, I think the first season was something like maybe 40 days or something. Maybe the second one was like 20 to 30 days. So these were way bigger competitions over much longer time spans than normal events, like normally like a 1 or 2 week event for non-major. So I'd say the first leagues were huge and were some of the biggest events outside of the prestige events and were very meaningful to win, which is why it was a scandal as to Luminosity left their org and therefore they couldn't play under SK Gaming, even though SK Gaming also had it, because you couldn't just be allowed to swap between orgs. It was an org-run tournament, not a player-run tournament. So I'd say the first day leagues were huge, but then as you go on, I think as they were less smaller and less meaningful, like when it was just the Clash for Cash, which is just a one-off show match, when you had that one that FaZe were playing against that Cloud9 with like Kiyashima and Flush. That was a joke on it, like a big clan or whatever. Like, in what universe was that comparable? So I think the other ones were not as good after the first year, so 2016. But you go and look. If you look, let's be real, like 2017, 2018, these are still huge events with massive prize pools, like $1 million. The ones that Astralis is winning against Team Liquid, these are still top events. Yeah, it's not quite the same stadium set up for the final, but it's still a big event, still a meaningful event. TV's a different kind of pressure, right? Then you go to events like Epicenter was amazing also for the first year or two, but every year was diminishing returns because they spent less money, spent less on talent, less top teams wanting to go. People were more sparing in the calendar as to whether they attended or not. I actually think Star Series is probably the most hard done by because there were some ones in history that had some incredible fields. I mean, in 2018, they had some where they had basically every top team in the world there. They had other years where sometimes it wasn't even as crazy on paper, but like, for example, there was that one in early 2015, like season 12 or whatever, the one that was won by Envious Mega Stomping Nip in the final. That was where every good top team except Fnatic was in attendance. And it was even a double elim format. There was no group stage for that one. So I think some of the Star Series have been amazing in terms of competitive level. It's just they haven't had the same prestige around where the venue is, or is it considered as big a tournament, or is the prize purse as big? But I think if you look at some of those, that was Swiss system with BO3 in every match, and like the top 15 teams in attendance, or the top 12 teams in some of those were bangers. And then you think of DreamHack Masters, for me, was always still at the level of these events we're talking about. Big. Yeah, obviously DreamHack Opens got very variable and went way down. I think the problem ECS has is this. ECS, in some ways, is kind of fitting that Blast fits in the spot ECS used to have, right? Because aren't they comparable events? Like, yeah, the prize money's there. Yeah, in theory, it's important. But there's never enough teams at the finals. There was always 8 teams at the final of ECS, and there's always 8 teams at the final of Blast. And so, because you've divided your circuit, it was online in the case of ECS, from the actual final, and then you don't have enough teams at the finals and you can't as a result make the spectacle big enough, it never feels like a Cologne a kind of eats it and comes nowhere close to a major. So yeah, the issue I have is I think in general the biggest ones of these are all some of the best tournaments ever. After that you get much I'd say more diminishing returns on how big it is, how important it is, how much people care about it. And I think some of them, like ECS, were just capped a la Blast by the way the circuit was designed, unfortunately. That's just the nature of the way the scene was seen back then. So there isn't really a hard or fast rule. Like, one of the good and bad things about Counter-Strike is, yeah, we don't have like a circuit where it's just like there are 4 Grand Slams to win. It's more like there's the majors plus the other best events. And even then, the best events, we aren't always going to totally know at the beginning of the year which all of them are. You also have to decide who goes to the events and how they end up looking and what the format is and all these sorts of things, right? Barbara Stanwyck's legs. I listened to your video on O'Neill and Bryant. So there's actually one I'm thinking of redoing on my side channel because I think I have way better arguments now. I think I was actually a bit too normie myself and how I approached it before. So it's the one about the myth that Shaq carried Kobe during the first 3 titles that they won together. Because if you actually watch it, essentially, he carried Kobe the first year, and even then it's more like he was just the clear 1 option and Kobe was the clear number 2 option. But even then Kobe was still a closer. And then in the 2001-2002 years, it doesn't even make sense at all. The only series which he's carrying are the grand finals. First of all, he doesn't carry the 2002 finals. Like, Kobe has bonkers numbers for that finals. Very good for his age. He carries the 2001 final, in which, by the way, Kobe also had, you have to remember as well, in the 2000 finals, he also was injured. But in 2001, the finals aren't even the best opponent you're playing. The best opponents were all the Western Conference ones. So if you ever go look at the Western Conference final, Kobe's as good or better in most of these years. And so it's just a nonsense narrative. So if we're talking about the idea of making an analog in esports, he says, what esports analogs to this myth come most readily to mind? So it's tricky because what we're basically looking for is a team that had 2 elite players, arguably in this case the 2 top 5 players in the league or the scene, and there's a perception that just one was the one carrying and that the other one got carried and therefore didn't really sort of get their rings. Now, that's very, very tough to find because that only exists in sports. I'm going to tell you right now, because the era when people started making that argument was before you could watch most of the games online or on YouTube. A lot of people hadn't seen the games and they were just looking at the finals as though the finals is the only match that matters and seeing Kobe had less numbers and Shaq's numbers are bonkers. So anyone who actually watched these matches, I don't think this even was a narrative. I think this is just something nephews made up. So the main problem you had is almost a unique sweet spot or nightmare fuel spot of ignorance mixed with lack of access to the information, and then people also just being egotistical, not admitting they didn't watch the game. So you're going to have a hard time finding that in esports, because I actually don't think people actually hang around long enough to keep stupid narratives like that. There are some. So the problem is really, if you look at the idea like one person carried the other, like I'll give you one that I think is a pretty good one, which is at the end of 1.6, you had Lurpis, the Finnish player, go over to America and play with Evil Geniuses, which was the former Complexity lineup, and then they obviously kept Nothing in their squad, who'd been around while the Complexity lineup had completed in CGS. So you had Nothing, this massive name in modern day CS at the time, added to an old crew of people who'd been the team that had won the major, etc., such as Fraud, who at that point was arguably the best player in 1.6 history from North America. Now, the perception was, thanks to things like Zonic's interview and the fact that they just weren't an elite team, that, the American players who came back just weren't that good, but Nothing was really good. And so it was just him like 1v9ing. First of all, he really didn't 1v9 that often. Like, I actually used to always say to Lurpus, like, man, I find this guy underwhelming. Like, I heard all your stories from practice and domestically, it's all good. But every time internationally, it's like, he just doesn't show up. So yeah, there was the MSI beat it finally. He had like that one game at like an IEM. You had like maybe like a Game Goon performance. But actually, there's a lot of big tournaments where I was waiting for him to pop off and go head to head with like Get Right or something. And he often wouldn't. So I actually think Nothing was overblown. Meanwhile, I actually think like Fraud was the sleeper carrier of that team. Like, if I had to look who's the most consistent at outputting the superstar numbers and playing their role, it is Fraud, isn't it? Like, sure, Fraud might have baited a little bit, but I think he actually just did his job a lot better. He was kind of like a Dexter now. People can argue what they like about him as a person, but he fucking puts the numbers up, doesn't he? Whereas to me, in this analogy, Nothing's more like what Flames when he was an OG. Like, sometimes he does it. The aim's there, the talent's there, but he's not really the one carrying. I think another classic one, look, I might be guilty of this myself, is if we're talking about tournament to tournament, no one in the old Pentagram ESC frag executors compares to Neo. But on specific majors, there are majors where Taz was a fucking stud and probably was the MVP of the major or real contention. And so people want to make it like he was just Neo and the rest all sucked. Kind of like what people try to make it sound like when Ziwu had those lineups in 2019 and 2020, where like he's far and away the best and no one else is like a true second option. But then they ignore that like the rest of the players are all super veterans, really skilled, like know the game, amazing experience. So similarly, first of all, you had amazing experience and team play within this squad. But also, yeah, there was times it was Neo and Taz. It wasn't just Neo alone. I'll also say along similar lines, before you got the Get Right and Gooks edition of Fnatic, people do talk, because DSN sort of like Khan transitioned to being more of a supportive element later, people do act as though before that it was just Forest 1v9ing the game in Fnatic from like 2006 to 2008. So first of all, in 2006, you did have Tentpole, who was really good as well. So there was actually more of a rifle core already. Yes, he left after 2006 and later went to SK. But then when he left, the other clear person who was like a star was DSN. DSN was the primary AWP, and he was having some really big tournaments. Yes, he wasn't Markov later, Sunder the year after, Kogu in his prime. But he was a really good fucking player, and he was a very good second star. And in fact, the fact that Stark Forest was such a stud with the rifle meant that this squad still had good firepower. Like, they were one of the better teams in the world still. So I think that's maybe misunderstood. People think it was just Forest, and then he had to wait for Gooks and Get Right to come along and actually really give him some help. I'd say the funny thing is, I can actually give you an example of what I think is this narrative that's misunderstood, which is, man alive, is Yuri dining out on his narrative from past years in Counter-Strike. Like, it has just been K Serato fucking carrying this team for the last year or two at this point in time. Like, Yuri doesn't stand up and, hey, they're sort of like the Brazilian Get Right in Forest. Like, nah, they aren't, mate. They aren't. Like, in this scenario, we're making Yuri Forest, right? I mean, skill-wise, it'd be case right to be Forest, but the guy just doesn't show up. Forest was showing up way more than this early CSGO, mate. This is ridiculous. This guy gets to just have, like, okay tournaments. Then I get told, like, they have 2 stars in that team. It's like, do they? Fuck, mate. So there aren't going to be many cases of it, I've got to say. In fact, like I said, I've actually got one that I think's a better one, because it is what the narrative should have been if Kobe had indeed been carried by Shaq. Stephen Dooley says, do you have any issues with the structure of the professional tennis circuit? So I'm assuming he means the ATP. If people don't know, basically, I actually think the ATP is the best sports circuit in the world, because it combines elements of what I like about the open circuit, loads of tournaments, some sort of freedom of choice to which you attend, or to attend for specific tactical reasons, to get prepared for this event, to actually to not have to play official games before a specific event, maybe one you struggle with, or to change up the fucking surface and get your warm-up reps in, or to come back from injury, or you are slightly injured, so you avoid some, but you can still go to the Grand Slam. I think there's loads about it that I like. The problem is this, though. I only follow the absolute elite level. I'm an elitist in that sense. I only follow Grand Slams, World Tour finals. Maybe I'll watch like a Davis Cup final if it's the best players playing. ATP 1000, if it's the later stages or a specific match, I'll watch it. But I'm not watching ATP 500, ATP 250. I might not even sometimes watch all the Olympics games. Like I say, there's some matches I don't care about doubles at all. So I'm only watching the very, very, very top end. So essentially, I only really care about what happens to the top 20 players in the rankings, how they're serviced, what options they have. So I don't know. Maybe it's terrible for the lower end. Maybe it's really hard to get in. Maybe when you do, you always get shit seeding and you get out. That could well be the case. All I know is from the top end, I love the way it works. I think it's fantastic. The seeding thing seems to make sense. And the way the circuit works is awesome. I think the way they have the different, I like the fact you've got the different surfaces. You know your little run that you need if you're going to be good by the Wimbledon. You've got to do Queens first. Then if you want to go to when you're in the US Open, you should probably play Cincinnati and a bunch of those events. We all know the runs that you have to do and how hard it is to do the French Open into Wimbledon and all that jazz. So I actually do think it's a fabulous circuit in general. I sadly don't know enough to know if there are real problems at the bottom. I suspect, though, that this actually is there's three main models. One isn't really sports, but I'm going to include it. There's three main sporting models I want people to look at for esports, because I think they are the best. One is the ATP, and that would be for people who would do like CSGO, League of Legends, Dota, because I think an open circuit just benefits these games the best, and the best international players playing each other is the premier product, the best currency you can have to make your game matter. So I like that aspect. Then you've got the Formula One approach. So if you have a totally self-contained circuit, I like the idea of doing like a monthly meetup. I think that's awesome. I've always said the World Tour for Painkiller in 2005 was one of the best esports circuits ever run. And then the last one is just pure WWE, essentially, kind of like what they do from the UFC. You don't have to put the next guy in just because he won 7 fights in a row. You can make him have another fight against someone else and earn his spot. Meanwhile, someone else hasn't had many fights, but it's just going to be a money fight, so you set it up now. I also think having a tournament, I've come up with this idea many times. I've told it to TOs. I was thinking of doing this myself at Flashpoint, which never got it off the ground. I told TOs, instead of doing those stupid events they did back in the day, like the one in like Barcelona Expo, they did one at like Gamescom in 2015 where Envious won it. You know, the ones where they had it where it's like, you can make alliances and then the fans vote what map you play, and you have betrayed each other and you actually have to play against this top team again. I said, instead of that, just do something like me, or it doesn't even have to be me, by the way, it could just be all sorts of different people with big personalities. Have an event where it's like we are just the one, like some sort of fucked up Roman Caesar deciding who battles on what map and then setting the stakes. We've got like a kitty, and so I can do stuff like I'll take the best team Vitality, but then I make them play like one of their worst maps against like a mega up-and-comer and see if they lose that, and then I give more money to the up-and-comer if they beat them in this map. There's all sorts of things you can do as fun challenges, just have one-off events that just run off narratives and just fan appeal and doing crazy stunts for the... I think that's another approach as well. So I actually do think this that the ATP is a circuit people really should look at. It seems to integrate like semi-pro into top pro while servicing seemingly all categories. If this is wrong, by the way, if someone thinks otherwise and they're a Fatron man, let me know. I don't know enough about the smaller circuit. By the way, why should I care? How about that? I'm not trying to play. I'm not playing in futures tournaments trying to get in the scene, am I? Toucan, another one, asks, what are your thoughts on Rafa winning another world championship in Quake, especially considering how late he is into his career, right? I think it's incredible, because the thing about this victory for me is Rafa was never just the guy. Like, if there was an equivalent of like a combine for Quake, would he even get hired as a pro if that was how he wouldn't have the highest vertical, the best tracking aim, the craziest rail, the best plasma bolts. Would he have anything the best? Maybe the best timing, I guess he could have. Or, you know, if he's answering some sort of cerebral, like, Poirot-esque, what would you do if someone was it? Maybe he could do those things. But if you think about all the traditional things of like make you a strong player, skills, like good, he wouldn't have any of them, right? So the idea he's won this many championships is impossible, right? So first and foremost, his mentality is incredible. He has an amazing mind for somehow he is feeling his emotions and he is feeling the thrill of the game. I can tell he gets super into these matches, but somehow he doesn't let it sort of like destroy his ability to make good decisions or to do the right thing in the game. I think it's so rare that anyone has this kind of mindset in the game. Like, I've seen Rafa lose, but it's usually by the other player playing way above the rim. Like, it's very rarely ever that he was the one that sort of opened the door for them to win the game. Usually you have to play the game of your life to beat this guy. Then if you know his practice methods, like he took what CZM did and went even further. CZM would just sit on a server, like playing like Europeans, or play on European servers, even on bad ping, just to get some practice in. This guy would just play anyone, as far as I can tell. He had a few people domestically he played, and even if there was nobody active in NA, he'd find a way to get enough practice and get enough practice with some Europeans, and they get warm up. And somehow he can always find a way to peak, to be good enough. Not always his best, but good enough. Then I think his drive is just crazy. Like, there are other great players, even Quake players, who still hang around. They still come back every 2 or 3 years, then they give it a go and try and win. Whoever had the drive this guy did, though, like year on year on year on year on year, even if he doesn't win, the drive to still just keep coming back and to still practice properly and purposefully and actually be disciplined about what you do, and then to take every match seriously, and then to not have hubris and be too egotistical, but at the same time to believe you can win no matter how good they are. Oh, the guy's just so unreal. Because the key thing about Rafa is this. Not all of them count for this in esports. There are some Koreans who are just amazing geniuses at video games, but actually they have nothing going on in their life. He's just a special human being. Beyond even just he's a good video player or he's a champion. He's just a really special human. And it's his qualities as a human that have made him so great in Quake and esports, not just his Quake-specific skill set. And then I'll also throw this in there. I have always thought that if you ever look at the GOATs of a lot of games, there's a trend I've noticed where they always seem to be the younger brother or the one that sort of it was the equivalent of like the kid who has no money, who's the pauper, looking in the window on Christmas, looking in and seeing a family having a lovely Christmas and thinking, I wish that was me. Because if he ever got a chance there the next year, wouldn't he really embrace it and not take it for granted like the spoiled kid who complains, oh, PS3, what the hell? I want the Xbox, mom. Like, he wouldn't do that, would he? Because he's know what it's like to be out on the cold. I've always thought Rafa was like that, because if you don't know, Rafa had a really religious background, and in the early days it's like he was too late. He'd missed Quake being the biggest game in esports. The 0-4s of the world had already been and gone, and he was coming along as a rookie right at the end of Quake. So you might think like, you could get discouraged from that. No, this guy just understood. I'm grateful for any chance I get. I'm grateful for what? Wow, Quake's an IM. Oh my God, that's incredible. What, it's still going after IM. You've got DreamHacks, you've got QuakeCons. Oh, I'm gonna keep playing. Why not? Oh, even into that, then we've got the Quake Pro League and Quake Champions. I'm going to keep playing that. This guy is just as grateful. By the way, it doesn't surprise me. He's a very religious, like a seriously, sincerely religious person. He just has gratitude for what he's got in the space. And so, yeah, he doesn't have the Painkiller World Tour. He doesn't have some of the old CPLs that we used to have. You don't have times where people can make ungodly sums of salary to play in esports as a pro in Quake and be one of the biggest names in the world. He's not even going to get the treatment that 0-4 and Fatality and Thresh had. Michael Jordan of esports, greatest gamer in the world. He's not going to ever get that treatment. But I tell you what, it doesn't matter. He's going to take what he can get, and he's never ever complained, and he just fucking keeps grinding out more championships. Now, I will say the problem all the Quake players and 1v1 game players have is it's like StarCraft in Korea now. It's still mega, but it's not quite the same as the old Korean scene. It's definitely not the same as a giant game like League of Legends with millions of people trying to be pros, right? So the problem you have is the competition size obviously is way smaller. And I even think this is a game a bit like chess, where you can't just hop in after 1 year and be the best at Quake. It's a bit like chess. Like I say, you've got to have a bunch of years. You've got to get started at the right time and really put in a lot of hours if you want to get past the information burden and level up on all these strategy concepts that people can take over from past Quake titles, and map concepts and map control concepts and concepts of how you play against people, like obviously the different characters, etc. changes that in Quake Champions. But even so, some of these things still exist to this day, and if you don't have that, you're behind. And this guy obviously is a fucking master. In this analogy, he is Magnus Carlsen or fucking Kasparov, or I mean, pick whoever you want, Bobby Fischer, any player in history, right? Could be any of the all-time greats, because the information burden in this game is crazy. Matrim, if you're familiar with it, how would you rate Tool's Fae Inoculum album compared to some of the earlier ones? Right, what's funny is when this album first came out, I get the feeling some people were trying to just shit on it and didn't think it was good. And the funny thing is, the first time I heard it, not when those first clips came up, but the first time the actual album itself was out and I think the first listen I had, I did think like, this isn't as good as I hoped it would be. Like, it's not bad, it's not as good as I thought. Like, some of it does sound a little bit like generic for Tool, as in it sounds a little bit like another Tool song I've heard. I did have that feeling, but what I've got to tell you is this, that went away really quickly. Like, this album is just a bit of a slow burner, but I do think actually if you give it time and you've got a palate for Tool albums, I think it's as good as anything they've done. Like, as an actual total overall album, I think the consistency of the real songs, not the filler ones, is mega. Some of them are some of the best they've ever done. They are exactly what you'd want, by the way. They're long songs that have different parts that build into each other and have, like, refrains and that repeat throughout it, etc., and certain melodies that build up. And some of it sounds a bit similar, but it's not quite, and it is new material. I mean, what's not to like after you've listened to this a few times, right? In fact, this album, sadly, just makes me think what could have been for Tool. Because if they hadn't had that lawsuit and or they just wanted to put music out, man, like, these guys waited like 10 years without putting fucking music out. It's a joke. Like, you think, this is one thing I hate about the Monday. It's why, in a way, low-key, I'm not that sad for some of the big musicians now who are like, we can't make millions to live in a mansion anymore over just a few albums. Like, well, you know what? Yeah, you're an artisan. Like, just do your art each day, get your money for it. If you can live without doing another job, I'd be very grateful that you're allowed to do that. Like, yeah, you are amazing. There was a sweet spot in the past of history where people did get to make a few albums, then live in a mansion with armed guards. But actually, why would I care about that? Yeah, that doesn't help me. And in fact, I get less albums out. Like, you just sit in the mansion doing fucking white powder drugs from South America instead of doing more albums. Like, when people had to actually hustle, like in the 1970s, my favourite bands from that era, just the music they did in the 70s is more than Tool's done their whole career. You go look at like Led Zeppelin, fucking Pink Floyd, the Moody Blues. These guys are just cranking out albums year on year on year on year, then touring here. Tool's waiting fucking 10, 15 years to do one album. Like, fuck y'all. That's just greedy. Like, at that point in time, like, maybe that isn't what art's for. What you get to be like essentially like a miniature fucking golden god of a civilization instead of just doing your job, which is in this case create art. Like that, I hate that aspect. By the way, as an aside, also the special edition of this album is fucking shit. Some of those tracks that are like building into the bigger, they're just wankery. Like outers do not get that. Try getting both of them and then just listen to the original one and understand that is the one you'll be listening to. There's so many skippable tracks on that special edition one. Now, I will say, this is why I pointed out at the beginning, I have noticed that ever since Lateralis, there is a trend of Tool fans themselves shitting on every album, saying they're all totally generic and that they're sort of washed, that's all just a rework of Lateralis, right? First of all, let's be real. Lateralis is just when all the worst Tool fans came in and then decided, it must be the best, it has to be. It's like people, like I'm a massive fan of Massive Attack. You must say then that the best Massive Attack album is Mezzanine. Why do I have to say that? Because you like them as well, and you heard that, and it's a popular opinion. I must now think that's the best Massive Attack album. No, it is though. Objectively, no, subjectively, that's your opinion. So even though I do actually think Lateralis is the best album, there's people you can tell just worship that album. And so every album, they used to shit on 10,000 Days. I can tell you I was there. Everyone's like, it just sounds like a bunch of the demo tracks, or like they've just reworked a bunch of the fucking, of like the main fucking riffs. It's just the same riffs. It isn't at all now, is it? Like you listen to it now, it's just a really good Tool album. It's clearly one of their best albums, by the way. So I'm not one of these people who gets caught up in that stupid trend. And yes, Tool fans are very fucking annoying. So my albums go like this. Number one, Lateralis. I think it's just consistently the best. It works as a concept album. I don't think you need to skip anything really on that one. Then I actually have 10,000 Days. I think it just has a fresher sound than the other ones. I think the set pieces on the really big tracks are fucking epic. I think it's a really good album. I love even that it's got like quieter moments, more reflective moments, but it's got the big tracks and the big emotive tracks. Like there's even more almost of like in a perfect circle blend into 10,000 Days than just pure Tool for me. Then I'm going to go Fear Inoculum at number 3, because as much as Anima once upon a time was my favourite, some of those tracks are more skippable. Some of that is a little bit too much more in the harder Tool era, which actually, quite frankly, I just don't think is as good, even though I do think actually Paul Demore was a fucking beast on the bass. It's a different type of bass, and if I had to pick, I do sort of prefer the Justin Chancellor, almost Pink Floyd-esque approach to doing things. Maybe you could even compare him to, who else would it be like? Maybe a Porcupine Tree sort of influences. I think that is actually a better Tool overall, works better with this generation of Tool people. So I have Lateralis number 1, 10,000 Days number 2, Fear Inoculum number 3, Anima number 4. I'm going to put Salival actually number 5, because I think actually some of those tracks, the reworks they did in the cover of Led Zeppelin is fucking unbelievable on that one. Undertow's number 6. It's an excellent album, but it does sound a little bit more one-dimensional now, even though some of the tracks will always be anthemic anthemic for me. And then obviously Opie was just an EP anyway, but that can be last, can't it? So I actually do think it's underrated. Like, I think some people just have decided they're just going to hate on them. I don't really get what there's to hate on. Like I say, I think it's just fabulous music, isn't it? Now, obviously, subscribing to my Patreon is one of the best ways to support me. I've got a whole bunch of I think I've rethought how I'm going to do my side channel. I'm a side channel Patreon, so I'll just say wait and see on that one. As I said at the beginning, if anyone's an old patron and you want to ask a question for one of these or be part of the donate discussion, just hit me up, tell me what your name was. I'll make sure it all gets arranged. Obviously, everyone's welcome to go check out the new thread, put a bunch of questions in there, and let's get one of these done more often if we have better questions, right? When I make content, it isn't just me, the mic, and a guest or a topic. It's also me with the support of my whole crew. Who's that, you might ask? The Skrilluminati. That's who. They include Frisky, Matt Pugnatio Rajcula, Ahmed Hadjou, Tosh, Tobias Bernasconi, Jensen Goh, Animosity, Torin, and you know it if you've heard it before, but if you haven't, a special thanks goes out to my main man, Jerky's Minion. Well, if you want to know upcoming topics and guests I'm going to have on my channel, maybe you want to ask me a question to answer in an AMA in video fashion. Do you want to hear one of those long discussions and actually be part of it and be able to ask me questions? Want to find out who I'm going to interview next? If any of these perks or more appeal to you, put your money where your mouth is. Join the Skrilluminati today via the Patreon link in the description box below.